Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to do a quick update on where we are on the Ukraine peace process. And one has to say right away that the peace process has stalled somewhat, and indeed, this is being increasingly acknowledged by the mainstream media. So the mainstream media who set a great store by the demands for an immediate unconditional ceasefire, followed by a tough direct sanctions on Russia on the part of President Trump, and the secondary sanctions on India and China and other consumers of Russian energy products, all of it as punishment for Russia for not accepting the immediate ceasefire. So that was, put paid to by the meeting in Anchorage when Trump decided that he accepts the Russia's position that there's no need to start off with an unconditional ceasefire. That what's needed was a lasting peace agreement, and almost immediately the media went into the next step, which is to begin a drumbeat for a summit between Putin and Zelensky. Somehow that would solve everything. We're meeting with Putin and Zelensky, which Trump may or may not join. Then, if Russia doesn't agree to whatever, then again, Trump can impose his sanctions, or Trump can impose the secondary sanctions, and so on. So that's the summit. And then the next part was the insistence that there be security guarantees, something like Article 5 guarantees for Ukraine, whereby the NATO powers would put boots on the ground. That's the European NATO powers would put boots on the ground, and the United States would provide them with air support. That would be a security guarantee. In other words, Ukraine would effectively be a member of NATO. Somehow or other, Russia was expected to accept this. And of course, if Russia doesn't accept it, then yes, sanctions, secondary sanctions, and of course, lots and lots of more arms for Ukraine. So that was the general expectations over the past few days, but nothing much really has happened, and I think this is leading to somewhat despondency on the part of the media, as one can see from the reports that have appeared this weekend. So first of all, we have the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who gave a very lengthy interview to NBC's Meet the Press. We can't play all of it because it's actually very long, but I will post it on our locals page so people can peruse it at leisure. But let's just watch a little bit of it and see again what the Russian position is, and it really the people like us who follow this um, consistently, really find this kind of tedious because, Lavrov isn't saying anything that he hasn't said before. The Russian position has been articulated many times on the question of a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. The Russians have said a meeting is not out of the question, but there has to be a clear agenda and there has to be a reason, a purpose for this meeting, namely some kind of a agreement would be ready to be negotiated and signed. More or less, by the time they meet, it would more or less have to have been agreed upon. upon signing. And then, so that was that. And then on the issue of the security guarantees, the Russians have explained many times over, and we have explained the Russian explanation here at the gaggle, which is that the security guarantees would have to involve not just the NATO powers, as we've been hearing ad nauseum since the meeting in Washington on Monday, but other powers as well. First of all of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, including Russia and China, of course, but maybe some others could be brought in, such as Turkey. And there would have to be an agreement among all of the security guarantors that Ukraine's neutrality, Ukraine's territorial integrity had been attacked before the security guarantee would go into effect. So no kind of NATO entry by the back door. So Russia have said this over and over and over again, but the media pay very little attention to this, and instead, I mean, running around over the past few days talking about how the NATO is ready to put its forces on the ground in Ukraine, and the United States is ready to use its air power to support these NATO troops, and and Russia somehow is going to accept this. So obviously none of this is true, and we can see this in Lavrov's responses to Kirsten Walker of NBC. So let's just watch a little bit of this.
And joining me now is Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Mr. Foreign Minister, welcome to Meet the Press.
Thank you. And welcome to Meet the Russian Diplomats.
Thank you so much for joining us after a very significant week. Let's dive right into the state of these talks. Has President Putin committed to a one-on-one meeting with President Zelensky?
Well, those are the speculations which are being spread by, first of all, Mr. Zelensky himself and his European sponsors. It was not discussed in Anchorage. It was raised later as something which is kind of impromptu, appearing from the meeting in Washington between President Trump and his guests. President Putin received the call of President Trump after that meeting, and he clearly stated that we are ready to continue the negotiations, direct Russian-Ukrainian negotiations, which started in Istanbul and already had 3 rounds convened there. And he said that meetings at the top level, the summit meetings, especially between the leaders of Russia and Ukraine, must be very well prepared. So preparatory process must be agreed. And for this, we suggested to raise the level of delegations who were meeting and will be meeting in Istanbul to address specific issues which need to be brought to the attention of the President Putin and Zelensky. And those issues relate both to humanitarian, military, and to political matters. Last time our delegations met in Istanbul, we suggested to create 3 working groups, including on political matters. More than 1 month passed already. There is no response from the Ukrainian side. And when Mr. Zelensky says the immediate priority is my meeting with Putin, well, it's basically a game. A game he is very good to play. Because he wants theatres in everything. He does not care about substance, and it is not by chance that now they try. I mean, the Ukrainians and the Europeans who attended the meeting in Washington, they try to distort what was discussed in Anchorage between President Trump and President Putin regarding, in particular, the security guarantees. I read some Bloomberg reports yesterday and today saying that the negotiations between US and Russia on security guarantees for Ukraine have been, in fact, undermined because of the demands by Moscow to include the principle of indivisible security. It's a very telling statement. Indivisible security is something which was enshrined in many documents adopted by consensus at the summits of Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, in particular, in Istanbul in 1999 and in Astana in 2010. This principle goes like no one can strengthen his security at the expense of security of others. No organization in the European space can pretend to dominate in military and political matters. And NATO has been doing exactly the opposite. So when we are accused that by flagging the principle of indivisible security, we are undermining the process of negotiations between US, Russia, and Ukraine, this means that the people admit that they want divisible security, that they want security built for Ukraine, which is being discussed now, but built against Russia. Those discussions, which took place yesterday, before yesterday, after the Washington meeting, they clearly indicate that people see security as only security for Ukraine, and they are prepared to send intervention force, occupying force, to the Ukrainian territory to deter Russia. They don't conceal that this is the goal. And this is not the way to handle the situation. President Putin and President Trump in Anchorage discussed the security guarantees, and President Putin recalled that in April 2022 in Istanbul, during negotiations initiated by the Ukrainian side, very soon after we started our special military operation, during those negotiations in April in 2022, Ukrainian delegation presented a draft principles to reach a treaty, to reach agreement on ending the war. Those principles were initialed by both delegations. And as regards the security guarantees for Ukraine, those principles proposed by Ukrainian delegation, I underline this once again, they provided for creation of a group of guarantors. This group containing of permanent members of the Security Council, Russia, US, China, UK, and France, plus they mentioned Germany, Turkey, and any other country which would be interested to join this group of guarantors. And guarantors would be guaranteeing the security of Ukraine, which must be neutral, which must be non-aligned with any military bloc, and which must be non-nuclear.
Mr. Prime Minister, we are...
All right. So in that answer to Kristen Walker's first question, I think, Lavrov really outlined pretty much all of Russia's positions, which is there's not going to be a meeting between Putin and Zelensky until there is some very definite agreement ready to be signed. They're not going to indulge Zelensky's entertainment goals. They're not going to take part in the circus. They're not going to take part in the theater. Zelensky has to be ready to sign an agreement. So there's no other way in which he's going to get a meeting with Putin. And the other part, which was the security guarantees, he spelled out what has been spelled out before, which is the indivisibility of security, and that therefore, if NATO moves into Ukraine with troops on the ground and with U.S. air power, then, as he put it, then we have divisibility of security. There's security for Ukraine, but there's no security for Russia. And so that's what he said, that, well, yeah, this is the whole point. We've been talking about this indivisibility of security since the 1990s. NATO hasn't been listening. We can only reach some kind of a agreement on security when we accept that everybody is entitled to security, not just NATO, the NATO countries and Ukraine, but Russia also must be secure against NATO. NATO refuses to discuss this. NATO just mindlessly goes on repeating, we're defensive, we're defensive, we're defensive, we don't have any aggressive intent, not realizing that just because you say it, that's not how others view NATO. And there's absolutely no reason to view NATO as a defensive alliance. That's absolutely nonsensical. And that's why NATO has got itself into this mess by continually just repeating this nonsensical statement. So that's the Russian position. And obviously the NATO powers don't accept this. And but as long as they don't accept it, then the fighting goes on. And if the fighting goes on, then there's really nothing to discuss, and there are no peacekeeping forces to be deployed on the ground. And it's understandable why the media are now realizing that there's no deal on the horizon. But for the media, there is hope, because if there's no deal on the horizon, and since obviously it's Russia's fault, because always Russia's fault, it's not our fault, it's not NATO's fault, it's not Ukraine's fault, it's Russia's fault. Since it's Russia's fault, and since Trump might be persuaded finally that it is all Russia's fault, then maybe Trump will be persuaded to take harsh measures against Russia. So here's a sampling of some of the media stories this weekend. And here's, for instance, a story from the Washington Post. You can see the headline, "Frustrated. Trump signals pause in his Ukraine peace effort." President Trump is signaling that he would step back for now from efforts to reach a Ukraine peace deal, expressing frustration over rising casualties and the failure of the two sides to come closer to a peace agreement. And then they quote what he said at the Oval Office on Friday: "I'm not happy about anything about that war, nothing, not happy at all." And he added that he would make an important decision about the future of the conflict in 2 weeks. That's, of course, his favorite standby, which is, well, I'll give it 2 more weeks. A phrase that he often uses not to specify a precise time frame, but to indicate that he wants to put off a decision for a while. After that time, he said, "We'll know which way I'm going, because I'm going to go one way or the other." During the course of this week, Trump has gone from boasting that he could bring a quick end to the war to expressing skepticism that he would be able to even to bring the leaders together for a face-to-face conversation. For all the diplomatic pageantry, however, there's been little sign of progress, with Moscow resisting any proposals to cease its attacks on Ukraine or accept anything short of its maximum goals for the war. I mean, that's the way it's framed, ignoring, of course, the fact that Moscow was ready to settle in April of 2022 under terms that were very unfavorable to Moscow. It was that deal that was scuppered by Boris Johnson's intervention. So after 3.5 years of war, it's understandable that Russia is now saying that the deal that was on offer in Istanbul in April 2022, that's no longer available. You're going to have to take a hit. Yeah, with the security guarantees, they're similar to the security guarantees we discussed in Istanbul, but you're going to have to take a hit. You're going to have to lose additional territory to what you would have lost back in April 22. And in fact, in the Istanbul agreement, there really was nothing about territory. The territorial questions would, according to the terms of the agreement, would be discussed at a later stage in a one-on-one meeting between Trump and Zelensky. This time, they're not going to be discussing it. I mean, it's just going to be the facts on the ground that will determine the territory that Ukraine will lose and the territory that Russia will gain. And I think Russia's view is obviously that, well, we've had to fight for 3 years. We've lost, I don't know how many tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives. That's a real sacrifice, and we're going to have something to show for that sacrifice. So what the deal that was available in April 22 in Istanbul is no longer available. So that's when they say, oh, short of its maximum goals. I mean, this is the sort of delusion of Western thinking that somehow they're going to get their way, even though the actual situation on the battlefront has turned against NATO and against Ukraine. So, you know, that they just delusional. You say, well, you know, we're going to get some of this territory, and Russia's going to sign off on these Article 5 like guarantees for Ukraine. And then, but it says here, outside analysts have suggested the White House misunderstood Putin's aims and may have been influenced by wishful thinking. For now, Trump said he would give Putin time to decide whether he would meet with Zelensky, as the president had requested. So this is, again, these pointless articles when the Russians have repeated over and over and over again that there isn't going to be a meeting with Zelensky just like that, you know, just for a chit chat, that you know, a clown show. They're not going to engage in that. And then the Post goes on. The White House said this week that Trump had secured a commitment from Putin to attend such a meeting. Kremlin officials, however, consistently downplayed the likelihood that the Russian president would do so. Meeting directly with Zelensky would imply Putin's recognition of the Ukrainian as the legitimate leader of an independent nation, something the Kremlin has refused to do. That's, in fact, incorrect. Because while it is true that Russia does not recognize Zelensky as the legitimate president of Ukraine, that isn't his legitimacy or otherwise isn't a condition of whether Putin would meet him or not, because then they would say, yeah, they will meet him because he is the de facto leader of Ukraine. The issue of his legitimacy arises only on the issue of his signature to some kind of a peace agreement. There is a question about his legitimacy, because if he's not legitimate and then he signs on behalf of Ukraine, then they might turn around, and Ukraine may in later years turn around and say, well, he wasn't really legitimate. He wasn't actually president at the time. That's the Russians' concern. I mean, one can argue about that. You know, one can think that the Russians are being hair-splitting or whatever. But there is a difference. They have not said that the reason why they're not meeting Zelensky is it has nothing to do with whether he's legitimate. The reason is that simply a media circus is, the Russians have no interest in that. But they've always said they're ready to meet Zelensky, whether he's legitimate or not. But the legitimacy only arises as to his signature. If his signature what is that worth? So again, we can argue whether that's a good position the Russians take or not, but nonetheless, the Russians have not said that they will not meet Zelensky because he's not the legitimate leader of Ukraine. If no meeting takes place, I'll see whose fault it is, Trump said, repeatedly saying that there are two actors involved when asked about Russia's sustained attacks on Ukraine this week. And then he left open the possibility that he could pursue economic penalties against Russia or leave Ukraine to go it alone. It's going to be a very important decision, and that's whether or not it's massive sanctions or massive tariffs or both, or do we do nothing and say it's your fight, Trump said. So he kind of throws this out there. Well, yeah, I might decide to turn against Russia, or maybe I'll turn against Ukraine. Who knows? I guess I'll decide in 2 weeks. Kind of a strange way to run your foreign policy. I don't know. I mean, I'll just decide whose fault it is, and then I'll punish the miscreant. But that's trying. But I'll decide in 2 weeks' time. Trump had threatened to levy large secondary sanctions on countries that buy oil from Russia, as well as new sanctions on Moscow, if Putin did not agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine. But he abandoned both the deadline and the ceasefire demand in the run-up to the Alaska summit. He has imposed tariffs on India over its purchases of Russian oil. And then Trump's frustration over the lack of quick progress comes as military commanders and top diplomats from European nations have been diving into the painstaking work of trying to translate what their leaders have agreed on, security guarantees for Ukraine, into practical commitments of troops and equipment. It's hard to see how you can make practical commitments of troops and equipment when there's no peace. I mean, there isn't a peace agreement, then you can't be a peacekeeper, even however dubious their understanding of peacekeepers is. You still can't have a peacekeeper if there's no peace. But so it's sort of bizarre that they're making all these plans, discussing these plans among themselves, when the issue, we're nowhere near any kind of an agreement. Russian officials have rejected the possibility of troops from NATO, countries on the ground in Ukraine, a guarantee Trump proposed after his Monday meeting with European leaders. European officials, however, have continued to meet among themselves and with their Ukrainian counterparts to work on what such guarantees might include. Trump displayed mixed sentiments Friday about Putin, whom he has long sought to cultivate as an ally. He held up a photo of himself standing beside the Russian president in Anchorage, which he said Putin had mailed him. He suggested it was possible that Putin, whom the International Criminal Court has charged with war crimes, may attend the World Cup, which the United States will host in 2026. The United States does not recognize the International Court's jurisdiction. I thought it was a nice picture of him, okay of me. Trump said, picking up the photo from the Resolute desk. So that was very nice that it was sent to me. But he also said that he told Putin that he's not happy about Russian strike on Ukraine that hit an American factory. The act involved almost 600 drones and 40 missiles, and Zelensky said he demonstrated that Russia was not interested in peace. We'll see what happens. I say over the next 2 weeks, we're going to find out which way it's going to go, and I better be very happy. Trump also refrained from showing support for Zelensky, saying that it takes two to tango. So this attack was, the claim is that it's an electronics factory. The factory produced nothing but coffee makers. It's very, very dubious. We don't know the details, but we do know that the fires from the strike on this factory lasted a long time. It took a great deal to put out those fires. So, when one has to raise real questions as to whether this factory really was doing nothing other than producing coffee makers. Anyway, Politico says Europe thinks Trump's peace talks will fail. It wants them anyway to call Putin's bluff. So that's obviously the plan, that, yeah, we'll go along, pretend we're interested in these talks, so that Trump, in his frustration with Russian obduracy, Trump will decide that, well, I've had it with Putin. He's been tapping me along. He's been making me look a fool, and now I'm really gonna hit him. That's the plan. And it's obvious that was always going to be the Europeans' go-to strategy. And then here it says, European leaders don't believe Vladimir Putin is sincere about a peace deal. So their strategy is to humor and praise Donald Trump until he finally reaches the same conclusion and realizes he will need to get tougher on the Kremlin. The European side thinks it's a win-win approach. They will be delighted to be proved wrong if the US president can negotiate an end to the Ukraine war with meaningful security guarantees. In other words, we'll get what we want and they'll be delighted. But if we don't get what we want, then we're going to get Trump to take whatever measures against Russia. But the primary game plan is all about calling the Russian leaders bluff and lobbying for tougher sanctions. I don't get why they're calling his bluff, since he's not. Putin isn't really bluffing. Putin has already said what he intends to do, what his goals are, and he's engaged in whatever peace negotiations were simply to outline to Trump what Russia was seeking, and to a certain extent, I think the Russians succeeded because Trump, unlike the Biden administration and unlike NATO, does appreciate that Russia does not want NATO on its borders. And I mean, he said that what's perfectly understandable. They don't want NATO on their borders. And that I think is certainly a major advance in American thinking, because up until Trump, it's just with this mindless repetition. Oh, NATO is defensive. NATO poses no threat. No one will tell NATO what to do. No one has a right to tell any country whether it can or cannot be a member of NATO, and that's all there is to it. Whereas Trump has understood, yeah, I mean, Russia does not want NATO near its borders. And what isn't clear whether he realizes, and maybe he does realize it, but Article 5 security guarantees for Ukraine with NATO troop boots on the ground plus US air support is NATO on Russia's borders. So whether you call it NATO membership or not, it is NATO. With preparations now underway for a possible summit involving Russia and Ukraine, leaders from across Europe held a series of emergency talks on Tuesday to weigh their response and share intel from discussions at the White House the day before. According to 5 diplomats granted anonymity to shed light on the sensitive calls, the presidents, prime ministers, and ambassadors largely aligned with Macron. Macron's the one who said Putin's an ogre, cannibal, and all the rest. But they said they expressed deep skepticism that the Kremlin would negotiate in good faith, but were optimistic. This is it. Listen to this. But were optimistic that Washington would punish Russia if Putin was shown to be the biggest obstacle to peace. That's their plan. Then they can just go ahead, ensure that Russia will refuse these security guarantees on NATO's terms, and then they turn around to Trump and say to him, "Look, you see, you went out of your way. You're so generous. You're such a decent guy. You went out of your way to go to Anchorage to offer him this fantastic deal, and Putin snubbed you. He snubbed you before the world. He's made you look a fool. What are you going to do about it? We have to do something about it. We can't be made to look stupid by Putin." That's their plan. It's clear that if we end up in a situation where Putin proves he doesn't want to end the war, that will force Trump to act, and it strengthens the case for sanctions, said a diplomat from one country represented in a virtual European Council session on Tuesday. The Europeans see US sanctions pressure as crucial to the diplomatic process, and many argue Putin was strong-armed into engaging with Trump in Alaska only after Washington introduced high tariffs against India over its purchase of Russia's economic lifeblood, oil. The dramatic next step would be to escalate some of the sanctions to throttle Russia's all-important trade with China. So that's always their plan. But of course, those are very big steps. Major escalation in any trade war with unforeseen economic consequences. And Trump really is very reluctant, understandably, to go there. But the Europeans, who have staked so much on this fight in Ukraine, they're desperate to push Trump into that position, though they themselves are not prepared to impose those kinds of secondary sanctions on China and India. They just want the United States to do it. A second diplomat confirmed that the Allies were happy to support the American initiative to broker a truce, not because they necessarily thought it would work, but because it will be a clear test of Russia's intentions. A third said the security guarantees being developed would help Ukraine negotiate from a position of strength. They're always repeating it, position of strength, while sanctions would ensure we have leverage on Putin. We found out how many was it? We're the 19th round of sanctions. We have leverage on Putin. And on the European side, diplomacy is now moving briskly. The EU held an extraordinary meeting of ambassadors until 2 a.m. on Tuesday, ahead of the leaders' call, and a separate video conference with the informal coalition of the willing, which includes non-EU countries such as Turkey and Canada. And then, anyway, so then, more on this. And then here's the New York Times. Peace talks in Ukraine all lead to the Donbas, and then basically the contested regions where Russia's war in Ukraine began a decade ago. Scores of Ukrainian soldiers have died defending it. Would Ukraine give it up now? And they're pretty much saying that this is kind of unless something changes, this is a lost cause. For President Trump, the map of Ukraine on the easel in the Oval Office had an obvious message. Russia had taken a big chunk of territory in the eastern region known as the Donbas. That territory, shaded in red, was gone. Ukraine needed to make a deal to get peace, or it risked losing more. And then former Ukrainian officials and political analysts said the only way Mr. Zelensky could convince Ukrainians to cede territory would be to deliver an American-backed security guarantee. That has eluded Ukraine since Mr. Trump ruled out NATO membership. But the guarantee would have to be strong with some mixture of European troops and US air support. Now, you can see what they're trying to do here. They're saying, okay, well, we will de facto accept this loss of territory, but we'll make up for it by the security guarantees. Now, why are they doing that? Well, it means that once you've got the security guarantees, or in other words, this Article 5 involvement of NATO in Ukraine, then you can restart the war anytime you want, because then you say, well, we never accepted the loss of this territory. And then, of course, it means within 2, 3, 4, 5 years, NATO and Ukraine will launch some kind of, military attacks, military operations in order to get territory back. They said, well, yeah, we never accepted the loss of this territory. So that's what they think is this very cute. Okay, well, we'll accept the loss of this de facto, but in exchange, we'll have the security guarantees. In other words, this will be a kind of a Minsk agreement, but a much worse Minsk agreement for Russia, because now we'll actually have NATO there arming and training Ukraine for the inevitable military operation to start getting this lost territory back. And then here, as Russia pushed on the battlefield, Mr. Zelensky, for the first time last fall, talked about the idea of temporarily ceding occupied territory to Russia in exchange for the security guarantee of joining NATO. See, that was when they conceived this plan of a kind of NATOized Minsk. So it's not even Minsk 3, it's kind of Minsk plus NATO. Mr. Trump jettisoned that idea, but in a win for Mr. Zelensky, Mr. Trump said last week that the United States would participate in security guarantees for Ukraine. Marco Rubio, the U.S. Undersecretary of State and National Security Advisor, is leading efforts to work out the details. Whether Russia would accept such guarantees is the real question. Well, it's not really a question. They've already said they're not going to do so for the obvious reasons that we've already spelled out. Ukraine wants NATO-like protections, but Russia started the war in the Donbas a decade ago, in part to block Kiev's path to NATO. Why would Russia allow serious security guarantees now? And of course, it wouldn't. And, so you can see where all of this is heading. Now, Trump, according to these reports, has kicked the can down the road. He said he's going to make a decision in 2 weeks. Chances are he's going to kick the can down the road again in 2 weeks' time. There'll be something or other. Will say that he's not really sure. He obviously doesn't want to impose these sanctions, not just because of the unforeseen economic consequences. These are serious steps, with these 100% tariffs on products from India and China and maybe others. But once he goes down this path, then the path of diplomacy is actually closed off. Then essentially he's embraced the Biden policy, which he has really striven hard to avoid doing. But he at the same time hasn't moved in any way to bringing this war to an end. So although he hints, and you can see there are hints of it, they're saying, well, maybe he's just going to abandon Ukraine and tell the Europeans, you know what, this is your problem. We're out of here. It's very unlikely he's going to do that. I mean, it's just, he's a part of the national security establishment of the United States. They're not just going to allow him to wash his hands of it. So, he's in this dilemma. And so that's the reason why he just keeps delaying having to make a decision. Is just like, Mr. McCorber in David Copperfield, something will turn up. That seems to be the philosophy of Trump. He's hoping that somehow something will be resolved and he won't have to make any serious decision. But anyway, we'll see what happens in the coming days. Thank you very much for today. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.